I'm quietly checking the established case record first, so the dates, locations, investigators, and testing methods remain accurate, while the narration itself stays source-free and unbroken. Tonight, the Chiverella evidence box rests before you, beneath a small archive lamp, its old paper holding nearly 6 decades of patient work. Let the day loosen its grip. Nothing here must be hurried. The room is cool, and the tabletop feels smooth beneath your hands, while somewhere beyond the archive door, an old ventilation fan turns with a low, even hum. You draw the box closer and notice the ordinary things first, because old investigations are often preserved in ordinary materials. There are folders, softened at their corners, typed reports with faint purple impressions, and photographs whose glossy surfaces have grown dull with age. The Rita Chiverella case has passed through many hands, yet each person who opened it began in much the same way, by sitting down and reading what the last investigator left behind. The year on the earliest folder is 1964, though the pages before you have been copied, marked, and reorganized many times since then. You can feel the slight rise where a paperclip once pressed into the cardboard, and you can see a pale rectangle where an older label was removed. We'll spend time with those first pages, but the Chiverella evidence box became especially important because it contained something the original investigators couldn't yet understand. They had preserved physical material from Marisa's clothing, collected carefully during the first long day of the investigation. In 1964, no detective could have imagined a laboratory reading an individual identity from that trace. The science didn't exist, and the language used to describe it hadn't entered the police office. Yet someone still wrapped, labeled, recorded, and stored what had been found. That quiet act of preservation would matter more than anyone in the room could know. You might imagine the evidence officer writing the date by hand, the pen dragging slightly across a rough label, while telephones rang in adjoining offices. Around him there would have been cigarette smoke, damp winter coats, carbon paper, and the muted tapping of typewriter keys. Nothing about the task would have seemed historic. It was simply procedure, carried out during a difficult investigation in a Pennsylvania coal town, by people trying to keep every possible answer from being lost. You can rest your hand near the folder now, and consider how patience sometimes begins without announcing itself, in a signature, a sealed package, or a shelf chosen for safekeeping. By 2007, the Rita Chiverella case had already remained open for more than 4 decades. The oldest investigators had retired, younger troopers had inherited their notes, and many of the buildings named in the reports had changed or disappeared. Yet the preserved material was still there, waiting in the particular silence of evidence storage. When new testing became available, the box could be approached with a question that had been impossible in 1964. Could the biological material on Marisa's jacket yield a usable DNA profile, even after so much time had passed? You can picture the careful transfer, the clean laboratory surfaces, and the soft snap of gloves being drawn over a technician's hands. The laboratory air would have smelled faintly of disinfectant and plastic, unlike the dusty warmth of the archive. Instruments replaced magnifying glasses, electronic records accompanied paper logs, and every movement followed a chain of documentation. We aren't watching a sudden revelation here, but a sequence of small controlled steps, each one designed to protect a limited sample. The material had survived years of summer heat, Winter cold, office moves, administrative changes, and the slow aging of everything stored beside it. Paper yellows, adhesive dries, handwriting fades, and metal fasteners leave rust-colored shadows. Biological evidence can also diminish, which meant the people testing the Chiverella material had to work with great care and resist the temptation to use more than necessary. In that laboratory, patience became a physical discipline. A technician measured, prepared, checked, and waited, while machines completed processes that couldn't be hurried by hope. You can hear the subdued tone of the equipment, and perhaps the quiet movement of a rolling chair across the floor, as another entry was added to a record begun 43 years earlier. The result was important, though it didn't provide a name. In 2007, the Pennsylvania State Police Laboratory developed a DNA profile believed to belong to the unknown person responsible for Maurice's death. The profile was clear enough to search, but the available law enforcement databases offered no matching identity. That kind of result can feel both promising and incomplete. You have something distinct now, a pattern belonging to one person, but no label to place beside it. As you sit with this page, you can imagine an investigator reading the laboratory report twice, hearing the thin rustle of paper while the unanswered name remained exactly where it had always been. The profile entered the file, and the file returned to its patient rhythm. Investigators could compare it with people considered during later inquiries, and they could check it again as databases expanded. Yet a database can only recognize someone represented within it, and the unknown man in the Chiverella case had left no direct match there. So the evidence box closed again, though the investigation itself never truly closed. The jacket and its preserved trace had spoken in a new language, but only the first few words were understandable. We can leave the laboratory report beneath the lamp for a moment, because to understand why it mattered, you need to turn back to the morning when the file began. But before we follow the new testing any further, we move gently to Hazleton on the 18th of March, 1964, where the oldest pages still carry the texture of that cold morning. Hazleton sits among the ridges of northeastern Pennsylvania, in a landscape shaped by coal, weather, and generations of close family life. In March, winter often lingers in the shaded streets, even when the calendar begins suggesting spring. You can imagine patches of old snow near the curbs, a pale sky above the roofs, and the smell of furnace smoke settling low in the cool air. The city was waking when 9-year-old Marie-Anne Chiverella prepared for school. She was known within her family as a sweet and shy child, and she was learning to play the organ. She also hoped one day to become a nun, a hope remembered by her siblings through all the years that followed. On most mornings, Maurice walked with an older brother and sister to St. Joseph's parochial school. That morning was different in one small and understandable way. It was her nun's feast day, and Maurice wanted to arrive early with canned food she had gathered as a gift. You can picture the cans having a little weight inside the bag, their metal rims touching with a muted sound as she carried them. The hallway at home may have held the familiar smells of breakfast, wool clothing, and the warm air of a working furnace. Outside, the morning would have felt sharper against her face, though the school stood only a short walk away. This wasn't a journey anyone expected to remember. It was part of the daily map children carried in their minds, where one corner followed another, and familiar houses marked the distance. You walk the route now only as a reader of the file, slowly and safely, with the old street descriptions resting beneath your fingertips. Maurice left early and alone, something unusual enough to matter later. Investigators determined that she was last seen at about 10 minutes past 8, roughly 4 blocks north and 4 blocks east of her home. That location became one of the first fixed points in the Chiverella investigation, a small pin placed into a map crowded with uncertainty. A witness remembered her along the way, and that memory would be repeated through statements, summaries, and later reviews. You can imagine a detective asking the same calm questions in slightly different forms, trying to learn whether the time was exact and whether anyone else had been nearby. The witness would search an ordinary morning for details that hadn't seemed important while they were happening. This is one of the most human parts of any old case. A person looks back across a few hours and discovers that a coat, a passing car, or the direction someone walked has acquired new weight. You can almost hear the pause before an answer, along with the faint scrape of the detective's pencil against his notebook. When Maurice didn't arrive at school, the ordinary order of the day changed. Her absence was noticed, and concern moved between the school and her family. We don't need to raise our voices as we follow those moments, because the surviving records already show how quickly people began trying to find her. The route was short, and that made the search feel close to home. Neighbors knew the sidewalks, the alleys, and the places where a child might pause. You can see curtains moving behind windows, doors opening onto the cool street, and people stepping outside in coats fastened quickly against the March air. Police work in 1964 depended heavily upon feet, voices, telephones, and paper. There were no street cameras to review, no mobile telephone records, and no electronic trail following a person through the city. An investigator needed to knock on doors, locate each witness, write down each answer, and return later when memory offered something more. The first reports in the Maurice Chiverella file reflect that slower world. Times were assembled from school schedules, household clocks, and the recollections of people who happened to look outside. You turn those pages, knowing that each entry represents an actual conversation held in a kitchen, a shop, a hallway, or beside a police car, cooling at the curb. By early afternoon, a man was helping his teenage nephew practice driving near an old waste area associated with the coal landscape. From their position, they noticed what first seemed to be a large discarded doll. When they looked more carefully, they understood that they had found Maurice. The location lay near the Hazleton Airport, within a former mining area, whose exposed ground and industrial remnants were familiar features around the city. There may have been wind crossing the open land, carrying the dry mineral smell of waste coal and cold soil. You can hold the landscape in mind without dwelling upon Maurice's condition, because what matters here is the care taken once she was found. Her clothing and belongings were recovered, along with the canned goods she had carried towards school. Those cans quietly connected the place near the airport to the child who had left home that morning with a thoughtful errand. We can imagine them being noted, one by one, not as dramatic objects, but as part of the complete record investigators hoped to preserve. The scene required measured attention. Officers established boundaries, recorded positions, took photographs, and collected what might later explain the missing hours. Their cameras used film. Their measurements were written by hand. and every item had to be placed into suitable packaging before it could travel. You can feel the cold stiffness of the paper forms and the slight tack of fingerprint ink used elsewhere in the investigation. A police radio murmurs from a vehicle, while boots press into uneven ground and a pencil moves down another line. The work is solemn, but it is also practical, because every useful detail must be carried from the open air into the permanent file. Among the items preserved was Marise's jacket. The biological trace upon it couldn't be called DNA evidence in any practical investigative sense, since forensic DNA profiling was still decades away. Yet the material was collected and retained, giving future investigators a chance that no one in 1964 could properly describe. That choice sits near the center of the Chiverella evidence box. You may turn the page and find many names attached to later advances, but behind all of them stands an unnamed or little-remembered person who followed procedure on the first day. The future entered the case through that careful pair of hands. Across Hazleton, the search became an investigation, and the investigation spread outward through the community. State and local police spoke with residents, checked vehicles, reviewed movements, and considered people who might have been near Marise's route. You can imagine a wall map under bright office lights, its paper surface marked with streets that local officers knew without needing labels. The phones would have rung through the afternoon and into the evening. Some callers offered direct observations, while others passed along rumors or fears that needed patient checking. Each message had to be written, assigned, followed, and either connected to the case or set aside with an explanation. This was the beginning of a file that would eventually grow to thousands of pages. It didn't become large all at once, and you can sense the accumulation happening quietly. One interview after another. A typed sheet joined a folder. Another photograph dried, and another officer returned from a doorway with a few lines of information. Investigators began by reconstructing Marise's morning as closely as the available facts allowed. They noted when she left, where she was seen, what she carried, and when she should have reached St. Joseph's. You follow beside them now, moving from a family home to a school entrance, then back across the same blocks, while the March daylight changes. A route that usually required little thought became a place of careful observation. Officers looked at side streets, garages, yards, parked cars, and buildings that offered temporary shelter from the weather. The city sounded different when listened to this way, with delivery trucks, distant machinery, church bells, and footsteps all becoming possible markers of time. Witnesses were asked about unfamiliar vehicles and unusual behavior. But unusual is a difficult word when applied after an event. A car may appear ordinary until someone asks you to remember its color. You might recall a door closing, an engine idling, or a man standing near a corner, yet be uncertain whether the memory belongs to that morning or another. The detectives understood this problem, even without modern research into memory. They compared statements, returned to people, and looked for details that remained steady across repeated interviews. You can picture the folders lying open across adjoining desks, their paper edges casting narrow shadows beneath the office lamps. Some leads arrived because people wanted to help, and others emerged from routine police knowledge. Investigators checked individuals with relevant histories, people whose movements required confirmation, and names mentioned by members of the public. Each person represented a path through the file, sometimes brief and sometimes extending through many interviews. The name James Paul Forte wasn't among those early paths. He was 22 years old in 1964 and lived in the Hazleton area, but police later said he had no known connection to Marie's or her family. His absence from the original suspect lists would become important only many years later, when a family tree pointed investigators toward him. For now, as you read the first reports, Forte isn't visible at all. There is no circled name, no witness statement placing him beside Marie's, and no photograph waiting to be recognized. The file contains an unknown person, defined only by what had been preserved from the scene. That absence helps explain why traditional investigation could work so diligently without reaching him. Detectives can follow a person only after some fact, witness, record, or physical clue creates a path. In the Chiverella case, the strongest path existed inside biological material that contemporary science couldn't yet interpret. Still, the investigators kept working. More interviews were added, more possibilities were examined, and the same timeline was read until its phrases must have felt familiar. You can imagine a tired detective loosening his tie late in the evening, then lifting the next statement beneath a yellow pool of desk light. The room might smell of coffee left too long on a warmer. Carbon copies would feel thin and slightly waxy, and the typewriter ribbon would leave some letters darker than others. Outside, Hazleton's streets settled into night, while families drew their curtains and listened for updates. Marie's family waited within that same changed city. Their days contained visitors, questions, condolences, and the exhausting repetition of facts they had already given. We should pause with them gently, because an investigation is never only a collection of police documents. It is also the long experience of people living beside an unanswered absence. Her brothers and sister would grow older, while Maurice remained 9 in every photograph. Her parents would continue hoping that the person responsible might someday be named. You can hold that passage of time without forcing meaning upon it, because their endurance speaks quietly enough on its own. In the first weeks, however, everyone was still close to the morning itself. Detectives could revisit the streets under similar weather, ask neighbors to stand where they had stood, and compare the angle of one view with another. The old coal city offered countless surfaces and corners, yet only a limited number of verified facts. One of those facts was the approximate time of the last sighting. Another was the recovery near the airport around 1 o'clock that afternoon. Between them lay several hours that investigators tried to fill through vehicle checks, interviews, and the careful testing available in 1964. Forensic laboratories of that period could examine fibers, blood groups, hair characteristics, and other physical traces, though their conclusions were much broader than a modern DNA profile. Results might exclude someone or suggest a general connection, but they rarely produced a unique identity. You can hear the caution in the language of older reports, where phrases such as consistent with or could have originated from left wide spaces around every finding. Those spaces weren't failures. They were honest boundaries around what the science could support. As we read them now, it's tempting to carry modern knowledge backward, but the original investigators had to remain within the tools and standards of their own time. They sent material for examination and waited for written findings to return. Mail moved between offices, telephone calls conveyed preliminary information, and formal reports arrived on paper. A detective might wait days or weeks for an answer, only to learn that a test had narrowed little and another lead needed to be checked. Patience in police work is often described as persistence, though it also involves accepting the pace of other people and institutions. A laboratory has its queue, a witness has a schedule, and a distant department must search its own records. You can turn several pages between a request and its response, feeling the calendar move beneath your hand. The Chiverella investigation continued through those intervals. When one name was cleared, officers moved to another, and when a report offered no identification, it was filed rather than discarded. That distinction mattered because an inconclusive result in 1964 might become a useful starting point decades later. Evidence storage became a form of waiting. The materials couldn't solve the case by themselves, yet they held possibilities in reserve, protected from unnecessary handling. You can picture shelves arranged under steady fluorescent light, each package marked with a number that connected it to a report elsewhere in the building. The Chiverella materials would survive changes in personnel, procedure, and technology. Officers retired and newer ones learned the case through their notes. The texture of the paperwork changed from onion skin copies to cleaner machine prints, while photographs shifted from black and white to color. But there was one more early detail that kept returning investigators to the same morning. Maurice had left home for a reason rooted in kindness, carrying food for a nun she admired. The cans recovered near her remained a quiet reminder that the day began with a child trying to give something. You can let that detail rest beside the laboratory report from 2007. Between the canned goods and the DNA profile lies a span of 43 years, yet both belong to the same preserved record. One tells us who Maurice was during her final morning, and the other begins describing the person investigators had sought. The earliest detectives couldn't cross that distance, but they could prepare the way. They documented the evidence, retained the jacket, and left notes detailed enough for strangers in another century to resume their work. We often speak of a case being reopened, though this one was never entirely put away. Instead, the Maurice Chiverella case moved through periods of activity and quiet. A promising call might bring several days of renewed interviews, followed by months when little changed. You return to the file again and notice how dates gather in clusters, like rings in old wood, marking seasons of faster growth. During quieter years, the box remained available. It might sit untouched while new crimes required immediate attention, but its labels still carried an obligation. Every so often, another investigator would lift the lid, smell the dry paper, and begin again with the morning of the 18th of March. Some would have known Hazelton personally. They might remember the airport road, the school building, or relatives who spoke about how childhood routines changed after Maurice's death. Others came to the file later and knew the city only through maps, statements, and fading photographs. Each investigator had to learn the same names and test the same assumptions. You can imagine them making fresh timelines on legal pads, drawing columns with a ruler, and placing question marks where older reports disagreed. The work wasn't glamorous, and often it produced only a clearer understanding of what couldn't be proved. More than 230 members of the Pennsylvania State Police would eventually contribute to the investigation in one way or another. That number is easier to understand if you picture individuals rather than a crowd. One person conducted an interview, another carried evidence to a laboratory, another reviewed an old lead, and someone else checked a name against a newer database. Their work accumulated without requiring any single person to hold the entire case forever. The file became a conversation between generations, written in report language and continued through marginal notes. You can almost feel the change in pen pressure as one investigator adds a question beside a paragraph typed years before. Time also altered the people named in the records. Witnesses moved away, memories softened, and some individuals died before later detectives could speak with them again. Addresses changed occupants, businesses closed, and the old mining landscape around Hazleton was gradually reshaped. Yet time wasn't only taking things from the Chiverella investigation, it was also bringing new methods closer. Laboratories learned to work with smaller biological samples. Computers made comparisons faster, and forensic DNA profiling developed from an experimental idea into a standard investigative tool. The evidence box waited through each advance. You might think of it as stillness, though preservation is active work performed slowly. Conditions must remain secure, records must follow the material, and every transfer must be documented so that the evidence retains its meaning. By the time the jacket was examined with newer testing, countless administrative decisions had protected it. No one had thrown it away during a move, lost its label, or separated it from the chain of reports explaining where it came from. The simple survival of the sample was therefore part of the investigative achievement. When the profile emerged in 2007, the unknown person finally acquired a kind of scientific outline. It wasn't a face or a history, and it couldn't tell detectives where he had lived. It was a series of markers, precise enough for comparison and patient enough to remain unchanged. You can imagine the profile as a key for which no visible lock had yet been found. Investigators tried it against the records available to them, but nothing turned. The absence of a match meant the man hadn't been entered into the relevant system, or that no suitable reference sample existed there. So the detectives returned to familiar methods while keeping the profile ready. They reviewed people considered over the years and sought lawful comparison samples where circumstances allowed. Each exclusion removed one branch from consideration, even when it didn't reveal the branch they needed. The sound of that work is quiet. It is the click of a computer mouse, the murmur of two investigators comparing notes, and the soft closing of a file drawer near the end of a shift. You sit with them beside the lamp, knowing the answer exists, but understanding why it still can't be reached. Another decade passed after the profile was developed. DNA databases expanded, forensic techniques improved, and public interest in family history brought millions of people into a new kind of record keeping. They submitted samples to learn about ancestry, to find relatives, and to connect names on family trees with living biological relationships. For investigators, these developments suggested a different way to ask the old question. A direct match hadn't appeared, but perhaps the unknown person had distant relatives whose shared DNA could point toward a common family. The path would be indirect, winding through births, marriages, obituaries, census pages, and generations of ordinary lives. This method required more than pressing a button and waiting for a name. A genealogical match might indicate only a remote cousin, separated from the unknown person by several branches and many decades. You would need to build backward toward shared ancestors, then forward again through every relevant descendant. The paper world of 1964 was about to meet the digital family tree of the 21st century. Before that could happen, however, the preserved Chiverella sample needed another kind of laboratory preparation, one capable of producing information for broader genealogical comparison. The box opened once more, and the old jacket returned to a clean surface under bright, even light. In 2018, Pennsylvania State Police began working with Parabon Nanolabs, a company using newer DNA methods to assist difficult investigations. The Chiverella evidence had already yielded a conventional forensic profile, but genealogical work called for a much larger pattern of markers. You can picture the request moving through careful approvals while every remaining portion of the sample was considered. Using old evidence always involves balance. Testing may create answers, but it may also consume a finite amount of material that can never be replaced. The investigators had to consider what the method could offer, what it required, and whether enough would remain for later confirmation. This is where patience takes another form, because progress sometimes means waiting until a technique is dependable enough. A test available in 1 year may become more sensitive in the next, and a weak sample may yield more information when handled with improved processes. You don't rush simply because the box is open. The laboratory work produced genealogical data that could be compared with profiles shared for that purpose. In 2019, the profile was searched through GEMatch, where people had uploaded genetic information while researching their own family histories. The first useful connection wasn't James Paul Forte, but a distant relative whose place in the larger family remained uncertain. A distant match is less like finding a name and more like finding a loose thread in a broad woven cloth. You know the thread belongs somewhere, though it may pass through families with different surnames, locations, and incomplete records. Pulling too quickly can confuse the pattern. So each relationship must be built and tested with care. The initial matches were limited and relatively weak. They offered direction, but not enough certainty to identify a single branch. You can imagine rows of centimorgan values on a computer screen, the pale light reflecting from a researcher's glasses, while the archive clock moves quietly through the evening. A centimorgan is simply a unit used to describe shared DNA, and larger amounts usually suggest closer relationships. Small amounts may lead back through several generations, where many possible family lines meet and divide. For the Chiverella case, those low matches meant the path would be long. Investigators could search public records, but records rarely arrange themselves neatly around an unknown person. A birth name might be spelled several ways. A marriage could carry someone into another state, and an obituary might omit the relative who matters most. You move from one document to the next, listening almost to the silence between recorded facts. In early 2020, a young genealogist named Eric Schubert encountered the Maurice Chiverella case while he was a student at Elizabethtown College. He was 18 and already experienced in genealogy, having begun learning the work as a child. From his dormitory, he read public accounts suggesting that new testing had been attempted without producing a final identification. He saw that the necessary elements might be present. There was preserved DNA, a usable profile, and a case old enough to require careful family reconstruction. You can imagine the dormitory desk, the blue glow of a screen, and the quiet concentration of someone noticing a path others might not have time to follow. Eric sent an email to the Pennsylvania State Police and offered to help. He later remembered thinking the invitation might lead nowhere, but sending it would at least mean he had tried. The message was modest, though behind it stood years of self-taught practice with names, records, and genetic relationships. Police work is understandably cautious about outside assistance. The Chiverella file contained sensitive information, and any collaboration needed trust, discipline, and clear limits. Rather than handing over the case, investigators met Eric and asked how he would approach weak matches and difficult family lines. That meeting took place in a coffee shop in Elizabethtown. You might hear cups settling onto saucers, milk steaming behind the counter, and low conversation moving around a table covered with notes. Eric explained how he could work around distant matches, test alternative branches, and use geography alongside genealogy. His answers persuaded the Pennsylvania State Police to begin an unusual partnership. The arrangement would still keep investigative responsibilities with the troopers, while Eric concentrated on genealogical research. He would suggest family leads, and the police would examine those leads through records, interviews, and additional DNA samples. The Chiverella evidence box had now connected people separated by almost every imaginable difference. Original troopers had worked with handwritten statements in 1964. Laboratory scientists had developed a profile in 2007, and an 18-year-old researcher was preparing digital family trees in 2020. None of them worked alone, even when decades lay between their efforts. The first evidence collector depended upon future science, though unknowingly, and the future genealogist depended upon that careful collection. You can see the investigation as a long table where each generation leaves a useful page for the next. Eric began with the low matches and tried to identify the families behind them. He searched obituaries, public trees, census entries, marriage notices, and other records linking one generation to another. The work required him to build more than 50 family trees during the next 2 years. Each tree began with people who weren't suspects. They were distant biological relatives who had chosen to share information, often for reasons entirely separate from police work. You can approach their records gently, because their role was simply to provide points of connection within a much larger human family. A surname alone couldn't solve the Chiverella case. Surnames change through marriage, adoption, informal usage, and clerical variation, while DNA follows relationships that may never appear under one shared name. Eric, therefore, had to trace families backward until common ancestors became plausible. Then, carry their descendants forward across time. You can imagine large diagrams spreading beyond the edge of a screen. Lines descend through siblings, cousins, marriages, and children, with dates and towns written beside each name. Some branches end quickly, while others divide until the page feels more like a map of rivers than a conventional tree. Hazleton itself became an important point of orientation. A genetically possible relative living far away might connect through an earlier generation, but investigators needed someone whose age and location could fit the facts of 1964. The search gradually turned toward family lines with ties to northeastern Pennsylvania. Progress came unevenly. A month of work might end when a new sample disproved a promising relationship. Another branch could seem complete until a missing record revealed that the assumed connection was incorrect. When that happened, the team didn't force the evidence to fit. They returned to the values before them and moved toward the next available line. You sit beside the file and notice how often patient investigation advances through exclusions rather than discoveries. The police contacted relatives, explained what they were trying to do, and requested voluntary DNA samples when appropriate. These conversations required care because the people being approached might know nothing about Maurice's case or their distant biological connection to an unknown contributor. A quiet telephone call could bring an old family history suddenly into the present. Some people agreed to assist. Their samples entered the same measured laboratory process, where tubes were labeled, seals were checked, and comparisons were completed away from public attention. Each result either strengthened a branch or allowed the team to set it aside. You can hear the rhythm of this part of the investigation in the waiting. An email is sent, a record request is processed, and a sample travels to a laboratory. Then the researchers continue elsewhere, while the answer develops at its own pace. The Chiverella family had already waited through more than half a century, yet the final genealogical work still couldn't be rushed. Eric and the troopers spent nearly 2 years moving among low matches and incomplete branches. Their desks held different kinds of evidence, but every item pointed back to the jacket preserved in 1964. At times, the strongest clue was simply a geographic connection. A family name appeared near Hazleton, or a descendant's history passed through Luzerne County during the relevant years. You mark the location softly on the working tree, then check ages, households, occupations, and relationships. One candidate might have been too young, another lived elsewhere, a third could be excluded through DNA supplied by a relative, and the line would narrow without yet settling upon a single person. The process wasn't a dramatic chase, and there was no need for it to become one. It was closer to restoring a faded document, working across the surface a little at a time until letters began to separate from stains. You look away occasionally, rest your eyes, and return with greater patience. By then, many original witnesses were gone, and the unknown person might also have died. The investigators understood that possibility, but identification still mattered to Maurice's surviving siblings and to the integrity of the record. A name would answer the question the evidence had carried all those years, even if a courtroom could no longer receive it. Among the branches, the team began moving closer to a family with the necessary connection to Hazleton. More samples were sought, more relationships were checked, and the names on the working tree became fewer. The archive room remains quiet as you turn the next page, where the lines of descent continue downward in careful pencil toward a household the original investigators had never been given reason to visit. I'm verifying the final genealogical chain and confirmation timeline. Then I'll continue directly from that unfinished page without recap or conclusion. That household appeared only after many other branches had been traced, compared, and gently set aside when the genetic measurements no longer supported them. You can follow the pencil line backward through marriages and maiden names, then forward again toward Hazleton, where several descendants had lived during the middle years of the 20th century. The line wasn't yet an accusation, and everyone understood that distinction. Genealogy produces possibilities before it produces conclusions. A shared segment of DNA may indicate that two people inherited material from the same ancestor, but it doesn't explain which descendant left the evidence in a particular place. You still need ages, addresses, family connections, and ordinary investigative work before the biological relationship begins to carry meaning. Eric Schubert sent possible branches to the Pennsylvania State Police, and the troopers checked them against the Rita Chiverella file. Their work involved property records, employment histories, old telephone directories, and conversations with people who remembered earlier generations. You can hear pages turning in a county office, while a clerk guides a finger down a ledger whose binding creaks whenever it opens fully. Some records were easy to locate, though others required patience. A person might appear under a nickname in an obituary, under initials in a city directory, and under a full legal name on a marriage certificate. As you compare those documents, the identity slowly gathers substance, though each fact must still be confirmed elsewhere. The researchers also had to account for the ways families change outside official paperwork. A child may be raised by relatives, a surname may be altered informally, and a biological relationship may remain unknown even to the people involved. Genetic genealogy works best when you leave room for those possibilities rather than forcing every family into a tidy chart. During the Chiverella research, low matches made that caution especially important. A small genetic connection can fit several possible relationships, each separated by different combinations of generations. You might be looking at a distant cousin whose common ancestor lived long before automobiles passed through Hazleton, and whose descendants spread across several states. The family trees, therefore, grew wide as well as deep. Eric built more than 50 of them, sometimes pursuing a promising branch for weeks before a new result showed that it couldn't lead to the unknown man. You can picture the rejected chart remaining in a digital folder, not erased, because knowing where the answer isn't located still has value. This is the patient side of the Chiverella investigation that rarely fits into a brief account. Most days didn't bring a name, and most records didn't settle a question. They brought another address, another marriage, or another cousin whose place had to be understood before anyone could move forward. Eric remained in frequent contact with the lead investigators, sometimes speaking with them more than once during a single day. Their conversations would begin with a relationship or a new sample result, then move toward whatever record might test the idea. You can imagine the steady exchange of emails, the low ringing of a telephone, and notes accumulating beside a cooling cup of coffee. The troopers had access to information a civilian genealogist didn't, while Eric could devote unusual concentration to the family structures revealed by the matches. Each side stayed within its role. He provided genealogical leads, and the police examined those leads through lawful investigative methods. Their cooperation also prevented the family tree from becoming detached from the original case. Every biological possibility still had to fit Hazleton on the 18th of March, 1964. You return to that date repeatedly, because a person who couldn't have been in the area couldn't become the answer, merely because his family shared DNA. Age mattered in the same practical way. The unknown contributor was male, and investigators needed to consider which men within the relevant branches were old enough in 1964. Some candidates could be removed immediately, while others required closer attention because the available dates and locations were compatible. Addresses carried particular weight. City directories offered snapshots of households, with names arranged beside streets that could be plotted against Marie's home, her school, and the roads leading toward the airport. You can spread a map beneath the lamp and feel the thin paper relax where it had once been folded. Hazelton's scale made these comparisons both useful and complicated. A person might live within walking distance of the Chiverella family without ever knowing them, because proximity doesn't always create acquaintance. The city was close enough for paths to cross, yet large enough for an unfamiliar face to remain unfamiliar. Employment records offered another layer. Workplaces established routines, associates, and possible access to vehicles, though an entry in a directory couldn't tell investigators what someone did during a particular hour. You can see how each record creates an outline without filling it completely. The investigators weren't trying to make a person fit the DNA. They were allowing the DNA to define a family region, then asking which people within that region could be evaluated through independent facts. This distinction kept the Chiverella inquiry grounded while the family tree narrowed. As new relatives agreed to provide samples, the broad genetic branches became more specific. A result might show that the unknown person descended through one child of a common ancestral couple rather than another. You could then close several large sections of the tree and concentrate upon the descendants who remained. The laboratory reports arrived in their own measured fashion. Each contained technical language, identification numbers, and comparison values that required careful interpretation. The paper felt new compared with the old Chiverella folders, though it referred to material collected before many of the laboratory staff had been born. You can place one report beside another and watch the search contract. An entire family line disappears from consideration after one exclusion, while another result suggests the unknown man belongs several generations closer to a particular branch. No single page contains the whole journey, but together they begin directing your attention. There were occasions when the direction changed unexpectedly. A presumed relationship didn't match the genetics, or a documentary trail ended with records that couldn't be found. Eric later remembered the investigation as the most difficult genealogical work he had undertaken, in part because those setbacks occurred after substantial effort. Yet a setback didn't return the team to the beginning. They retained everything learned about the surviving branches and shifted toward the next most useful question. You can sense their method in the notes, where a crossed line is followed by another carefully drawn beneath it. Months passed this way. The seasons changed outside the college windows and the Troop N offices, while the family trees continued spreading across screens. Spring rain gave way to summer heat, autumn leaves gathered along Hazelton curves, and winter placed a pale crust over the old coal ground. The Chiverella evidence remained stable through those changing months. Its profile didn't become impatient, and it didn't alter when a promising branch failed. That constancy gave the team something firm to return to whenever the documentary record became uncertain. Eventually, the samples and family research narrowed the possible source to 4 men. 4 is a small number compared with the many names considered during nearly 6 decades, but it still isn't one. You can imagine the working document now, with each candidate separated into his own quiet column. The investigators reviewed the 4 men, without assuming that the most noticeable history must provide the answer. They checked dates, residences, relationships, and whatever records could establish each person's connection to the relevant family line. The DNA had brought them close, though conventional police work still needed to carry the investigation forward. One of those four names was James Paul Forte. He had been born in Hazleton, lived in the area throughout his life, and was 22 years old when Maurice disappeared. His home was only about 6 or 7 blocks from the Chiverella residence, though police found no known relationship between him and Maurice's family. You can return to the old city map and mark those few blocks softly. The distance is ordinary, neither remote nor especially close in a compact neighborhood. It tells investigators that Forte could have been nearby, but it doesn't tell them that he was. That restraint remained important. A map can establish possibility, while only evidence can establish identity. You let the streets lie flat beneath the archive lamp and remember that many innocent people lived within the same radius. Forte's name hadn't appeared during the original Chiverella investigation. No early witness had identified him. No surviving report placed him on Maurice's route, and no tip had directed detectives toward his household. If the genetic genealogy had never reached his branch, the old file offered no obvious reason to find him. This explains why rereading the 1964 reports alone couldn't solve the case. The answer wasn't hidden as a missed confession or a name written faintly in a margin. It existed outside the known suspect pool, connected to the evidence through biology rather than through an earlier statement. Investigators began assembling a fuller account of Forte's life. He worked as a bartender and also sold bar supplies, occupations that placed him within the familiar social landscape of the Hazleton area. You can imagine old business listings, yearbook pages, and newspaper archives being drawn together across a desk. A yearbook photograph offered a face from his younger years. The print would have been small and slightly grainy, surrounded by other students whose lives had moved in many directions. When removed from that ordinary context and copied into an investigative file, the image acquired a significance it hadn't carried before. Still, a photograph couldn't answer the genetic question. Neither could an address, an occupation, or the fact that Forte had remained in the area. Those details helped establish that he was a viable candidate, while the Chiverella DNA continued to require direct confirmation. Forte's later criminal record gave investigators another reason to examine him carefully. In 1974, 10 years after Maurice's death, he was arrested following an assault upon a young woman in the Hazleton area. The surviving record described a serious encounter, though we can leave its painful particulars outside our quiet room tonight. He eventually pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and received probation. That history didn't prove involvement in the Chiverella case, because one conviction can't substitute for evidence in another investigation. It did, however, distinguish Forte from the other genealogically possible men and gave troopers a relevant fact to evaluate. Investigators also found that Forte had been arrested again in 1978 on charges involving reckless endangerment and harassment. Public accounts didn't establish a final disposition for that matter. You can see why a careful report would state only what the records supported, leaving uncertain details plainly uncertain. The woman involved in the 1974 case was located and interviewed during the renewed investigation. Speaking with her required compassion because the detectives were asking her to revisit a difficult event from many years earlier. Her information helped them understand Forte's known behavior, though the DNA question still remained separate. That separation protected the integrity of the Chiverella investigation. A troubling history could guide attention, but it couldn't supply the final answer. You needed a sample attributable to James Paul Forte himself, compared directly with the profile obtained from Maurice's jacket. There was an immediate practical difficulty. Forte had died in 1980, at the age of 38, reportedly from natural causes. He had never married and had no known children, which limited the close family references that might otherwise assist the comparison. A child can provide a strong biological link to a parent, and a living sibling may also be useful, though neither is identical to the person being investigated. More distant relatives can narrow a line, but may not provide the direct certainty needed to close a homicide case. The team, therefore, continued collecting and comparing what was available. You can imagine the family tree becoming more detailed around Forte's branch. Dates are checked against cemetery records. Siblings are placed in the proper order, and surviving relatives are contacted with care. Each conversation carries the odd weight of asking one family to help answer a question belonging to another. The relatives themselves weren't responsible for what the investigation might reveal. Genetic genealogy follows inheritance, not guilt, and the troopers had to make that distinction clear. A cousin's sample could illuminate the family structure without casting suspicion upon the cousin. Some relatives offered their cooperation. Their willingness allowed the researchers to test additional relationships and move closer to Forte's place within the tree. You can hear a swab packet opening, paper instructions unfolding, and a pen moving across a consent form on a quiet kitchen table. The samples were sent for analysis, and once again the case entered a period of waiting. Laboratory work doesn't become faster because an answer feels near. Reagents must be prepared, controls must behave properly, and the resulting data must be reviewed before anyone treats it as meaningful. One result strengthened the direction toward Forte's immediate family. Another allowed investigators to exclude a different candidate. Eric later recalled moments when he felt the pattern had become persuasive, only to hear the police remind him that more work remained. Their caution wasn't doubt for its own sake. It reflected the difference between an investigative lead and a final identification. You can be nearly certain in your own mind and still need the evidence to meet a clearer, more defensible standard. This disciplined waiting protected Maurice's family as well. Announcing a name too soon could replace one long uncertainty with another. The investigators wanted the answer to rest upon a direct comparison that could withstand every reasonable question. As the research continued, Eric searched for people who knew the history of the relevant families. A knowledgeable family historian could sometimes supply relationships missing from public trees or explain why a surname had changed. These helpers often kept their information in old albums, handwritten charts, and boxes of obituaries clipped from local newspapers. You can picture one of those boxes opening on a dining table. The paper inside carries the dry scent of attics, and some clippings have browned along their folds. A name that seemed isolated on a computer screen becomes a brother, an uncle, or a cousin when placed beside those family records. One family historian provided information that helped the genealogical structure settle into place. The connection didn't arrive as a dramatic disclosure, but as another carefully supported relationship. It allowed Eric and the troopers to see how the low DNA matches converged upon the branch containing James Paul Forte. The family tree had now traveled backward through shared ancestors and forward through many descendants, returning at last to Hazleton. You can trace the route with your fingertip, though it crosses more than a century before reaching the four possible men. Forte's combination of age, location, genetic position, and documented history made him the strongest candidate. Even then, the word candidate remained necessary. The indirect DNA had pointed toward him, but indirect evidence leaves room for a close biological relative occupying a similar place in the tree. A direct sample from Forte would remove that ambiguity. Investigators looked for personal items that might reliably contain his DNA. In other cases, preserved medical specimens, envelopes, razors, or brushes have sometimes provided such material. Yet every object introduces questions about ownership, handling, contamination, and whether another person may have used it. The Chiverella team needed a source they could attribute to Forte with confidence. An old household object might feel easier than disturbing a grave, but ease isn't the same as certainty. You can imagine investigators discussing each possibility while the file lies open between them. Because Forte had died more than 40 years earlier, obtaining a direct sample required legal and practical planning. His burial place had to be verified, permission had to be sought through the proper authorities, and the purpose of an exhumation had to be supported by the accumulated evidence. This wasn't a step taken lightly. A grave isn't merely a source of biological material. It is a place connected to family memory, community custom, and the dignity owed to human remains. The investigators had to balance those concerns against the need to answer a question that had remained open since Maurice was 9. The Luzerne County District Attorney's Office worked with the Pennsylvania State Police as that decision moved forward. Genealogical findings, relative comparisons, and the old case evidence were organized into a coherent account. You can feel the weight of the assembled pages, newer laboratory reports resting above typewritten statements from 1964. Every stage depended upon the one before it. Without the preserved jacket, there would have been no forensic profile. Without the profile, there would have been no genealogical search, and without the family trees, no basis for focusing upon Forte. The chain also extended through people who might never have met one another. An evidence officer from the first investigation, a laboratory scientist in 2007, a relative who shared DNA, a college student in 2020, and a modern trooper all occupied different places within the same patient process. You can think of the Chiverella file as the thread joining them. Its pages passed from hand to hand, while the material in storage remained sealed and accounted for. The answer was approached through cooperation spread across time. By late 2021, the investigation had moved far beyond the distant match that began the genealogical phase. Forte's position within the family line had been tested through additional samples, and alternative branches had been reduced. The team could now present a reasoned basis for obtaining DNA from his remains. The paperwork for an exhumation carried a different texture from a family tree. It used formal language, exact identifiers, and clearly stated purposes. You can imagine signatures added under bright office light, while winter settled over northeastern Pennsylvania outside. January of 2022 arrived with hard ground and short days. Nearly 58 years had passed since the first evidence was collected from Maurice's clothing. The investigators were now preparing to recover a direct sample from the man they believed had left it. There was no public ceremony around the exhumation. It was an investigative procedure conducted with legal authorization and professional care. Cemetery staff, forensic personnel, and law enforcement each had defined responsibilities, and the chain of custody began before any sample was removed. You can imagine the winter air feeling clean and sharp, with breath briefly visible above scarves and coat collars. Machinery sounds low against the stillness, and damp earth gives off a mineral smell different from the dry coal ground described in the older reports. Everyone present understands that the work must be respectful and exact. Forte's remains had been buried for more than 4 decades. Time affects biological material, even in protected conditions, and technicians couldn't assume that every sample would produce a complete profile. They selected tissue suitable for testing and documented where it came from. Labels were prepared carefully. A single error could weaken the comparison, so names, numbers, dates, and seals were checked by more than one person. You can hear the soft repetition of identifying information as one professional reads and another verifies. The recovered sample was packaged for transport to the laboratory. Its movement was recorded at every transfer, creating a modern chain beside the older chain attached to Maurice's jacket. 2 pieces of evidence, collected 58 years apart, were now traveling toward the same comparison. This was the closest the Chiverella investigation had ever come to a direct answer. Yet the troopers still couldn't speak to the family with certainty, and they couldn't announce Forte's name. The laboratory needed to extract usable DNA, produce a profile, and compare it independently with the unknown profile from 2007. You return with them to the quieter setting of the office. Coats dry near a radiator. Winter grit marks the entrance floor, and the case folder lies beneath white fluorescent light. The exhumation has been completed, but completion of a procedure isn't completion of the investigation. Waiting at this stage can feel different from waiting during the earlier decades. The possible answer is no longer an abstract hope held somewhere in future science. It is being processed in a laboratory, behind a door the investigators can't open simply because they want to know. They review their work again. The genealogical branches are checked. The sample documentation is confirmed, and the original profile remains available for comparison. You can imagine Corporal Mark Barron reading an old report while the hum of office equipment fills the pauses. Barron had grown up in the region, as had others involved with Troop N. The Chiverella case wasn't merely an old entry in a statewide archive for them. It belonged to the memory of Hazleton, where parents had repeated Maurice's name when teaching children to be careful. The case had altered local habits after the 18th of March, 1964. Children who once walked freely were accompanied more often, and families watched familiar streets differently. You can't measure that kind of change in laboratory units, yet it remains part of the investigation's human record. Retired Trooper James Quiroz had carried the case during an earlier period, and other investigators had done the same before and after him. Each inherited not only the files, but the expectation that another method might eventually become available. The new DNA comparison rested upon their willingness to keep returning. Lieutenant Devon Brutusky understood the unusual span of that work. The Pennsylvania State Police had been founded in 1905, which meant the agency had investigated Maurice's case for more than half its existence. You can let that proportion settle quietly, because it shows how a single file can outlast careers, buildings, and entire systems of technology. The earliest troopers had communicated by radio and typewritten memorandum. The newest team could examine millions of genetic markers and send secure digital files within moments. Yet both generations depended upon the same habits of labeling, checking, and recording. The laboratory received the sample from Forte's remains and began extraction. Technicians worked in controlled spaces designed to prevent contamination, using protective clothing and cleaned equipment. The air carried little scent beyond filtered coolness and the faint sterile trace of prepared surfaces. Old tissue presents challenges that a fresh reference sample doesn't. DNA breaks into smaller fragments over time, and environmental conditions may reduce the amount available. You can picture the scientists adjusting their methods carefully, trying to recover enough information without overstating what the sample could provide. Controls accompanied the procedure. Blank samples helped reveal contamination, while known standards showed whether the instruments and reagents were functioning properly. The apparent quiet of the laboratory concealed a great deal of verification. No one leaned over a machine waiting for a name to appear. Results emerged through stages, each requiring interpretation and review. You might hear only the light tap of keys, the muted closing of a cabinet, and the steady airflow above the workbench. Meanwhile, Eric continued examining the family tree. Even with Forte's sample in testing, the genealogical work remained useful because it explained why investigators had chosen him. If the direct comparison excluded Forte, those same records would guide the team toward the remaining candidates. He had already experienced enough unexpected results to avoid treating his confidence as proof. A family tree can appear complete until one biological relationship differs from the paper record. You keep the alternative branches nearby, even when one seems much stronger. The troopers also prepared for both possible outcomes. If the profiles didn't match, they would return to the four-person group and reconsider how the shared DNA had been inherited. If they did match, the team would still need independent review before informing Maurice's family. This is what patient investigation looks like near its answer. It doesn't abandon caution in the final few steps. The same care used to preserve the Chiverella evidence box must govern the moment when that evidence is finally understood. Days passed after the sample entered the laboratory. January moved toward February, with weak daylight resting briefly on office windows before winter evening returned. You can hear salt scatter beneath car tires in the parking lot, while investigators arrive, work, and leave without public attention. The Chiverella siblings knew the case remained active, though they had lived through other periods of renewed hope before. Their parents had died without learning the identity of the person responsible. That knowledge made the investigators especially careful about when and how any result would be shared. Hope, after many decades, develops its own restraint. A family learns not to mistake every new test for an answer, even while wanting the test to succeed. You can imagine a telephone resting on a table in a quiet home. capable of bringing news but silent for another evening. Back in the laboratory, enough DNA had been recovered to construct Forte's direct profile. The markers were arranged for comparison with the profile derived from Mary's jacket. This wasn't a search through distant relatives now, but a question of whether two samples came from the same individual. The computer-assisted comparison could be completed quickly once valid profiles existed, though the conclusion required human review. Analysts examined the data, checked the controls, and calculated the statistical weight. You can picture two columns aligning across a screen, each marker considered in sequence. A match statistic doesn't mean that one person among a certain number has actually been tested. It expresses how extraordinarily unlikely the same profile would appear in an unrelated individual chosen at random. The larger the figure, the stronger the support that the samples share a single source. In the Chiverella case, the final calculation would be expressed in a number almost too large for ordinary experience. Investigators would later state that the chance of selecting an unrelated person with the same profile was 1 in 480 septillion. You don't need to hold all those zeros in your mind tonight. What mattered was the directness of the match. Before that result could leave the laboratory, another qualified analyst reviewed the work. Evidence of this importance shouldn't depend upon one person's reading, even when the markers appear clear. The extraction records, instrument data, and calculations all received another careful examination. The date was the 3rd of February, 2022, when the confirmed result reached the investigative team. You can imagine the notification arriving without music or ceremony, perhaps through a telephone call or a secure message whose plain words carried nearly 58 years of waiting. The DNA from James Paul Forte's remains matched the profile developed from the biological material preserved on Mary's Chiverella's jacket. The genealogical path had led to the correct man. For the first time since 1964, the unknown space in the file could be filled with a supported identity. Even then, the room may have remained quiet for several seconds. Long investigations teach people not to react before they've heard every qualification. You read the finding once, then again, while the hum of the building continues unchanged around you. Eric received a call explaining the strength of the result. He had felt the team was close during earlier stages, but this was different. The direct comparison had transformed a genealogical conclusion into a forensic identification. For the investigators, relief arrived alongside the knowledge that Forte could never be questioned or prosecuted. He had died more than 40 years earlier, carrying whatever explanation he might have offered beyond the reach of the file. The DNA answered who, though it couldn't answer every question surrounding the morning. You can sit with that limitation without allowing it to diminish the work. Old cases rarely yield every detail, even when an identity becomes certain. A solved name may close the central question, while leaving smaller spaces permanently unfilled. The team began preparing to tell the Chiverella family. That conversation belonged to them before it belonged to the public, and it required more care than an ordinary investigative update. The siblings had spent most of their lives knowing Maurice through memory rather than shared adulthood. Her photograph had remained young, while theirs changed across the decades. They had finished school, built careers and families, and watched their parents grow older without receiving the answer they wanted. You can imagine how a single name might bring relief, sorrow, and an immediate return to the morning they last saw her. Investigators explained that the DNA match identified James Paul Forte. They also explained that he had been 22 in 1964, that he had lived nearby, and that no known relationship connected him to Maurice. The family finally had an identity, but not a conversation with the person or a courtroom proceeding. That absence shaped the kind of justice available. Forte couldn't be arrested, questioned, or sentenced, and there would be no trial presenting the evidence before a jury. The official record could nevertheless state that the investigation had identified the person responsible. Maurice's parents had never asked for revenge. According to the family's later account, they had wanted truth and justice, and they had trusted that investigators might one day provide them. You can feel the sadness that the answer arrived after both parents were gone. Their children received it in their place. Ronald, Barry, David, and Carmen Marie had carried Maurice's memory into later life, along with the unanswered question. Now, they could attach a name to the unknown person, though no name could restore the years their sister never lived. The police also began organizing a public announcement. A case so deeply woven into Hazleton's history required more than a short written notice. Current investigators, retired troopers, family members, and the young genealogist who had helped complete the search would be brought together. The press conference was scheduled for the 10th of February, 1 week after the laboratory confirmation. That interval allowed reports to be finalized, displays to be prepared, and the investigative conclusion to be stated with precision. You can picture folders being checked once more before anyone stood at a microphone. A photograph of Maurice was enlarged for the room. Beside it, flowers and a trooper's hat offered a quiet acknowledgement of the many people connected to the case. The image showed the child at the center of all those years of work, rather than allowing the newly identified man to occupy the entire story. A yearbook photograph of Forte was also prepared, because the public needed to know whom the evidence had identified. His face, once buried among rows of students, would now appear beside the explanation of the DNA work. You can sense how strange such a transformation is, from an ordinary school image to a final piece of an old police file. The room filled slowly on the morning of the announcement. Chairs moved softly across the floor. Camera equipment clicked into place, and low conversations quieted as the speakers assembled. Retired investigators saw colleagues they hadn't worked beside for years. Among those present was a trooper connected to the first investigation. Nearly 6 decades separated his early work from the genetic confirmation. Yet the evidence collected in his era had made the modern result possible. You can imagine him looking toward Maurice's photograph while younger officers reviewed their prepared remarks. Eric Schubert was 20 by then. He had entered the partnership as an 18-year-old student who sent an uncertain email from college. Now he sat among experienced investigators, knowing that more than 50 family trees and 2 years of quiet research had helped bring everyone into that room. Corporal Mark Barron prepared to describe the investigative process. The case had become personal to him, despite the professional advice investigators often receive about maintaining distance. Growing up in the area meant that Maurice's name belonged to his own understanding of Hazleton. Lieutenant Devon Brutusky would explain the span of the investigation and the role of forensic science. Trooper Anthony Petrosky helped present the information publicly, while others who had handled earlier phases stood nearby. No one person could claim the answer, because the Chiverella file had been carried too far and too long for that. The family sat together within the room. Their presence returned the investigation to its human beginning, before databases, laboratory instruments, and genealogical charts. You can hear the subdued movement of papers settling as the microphones become live. When the announcement began, the speakers stated Maurice's name before dwelling upon the man identified by the evidence. They described her age, her walk to school, and the preservation that had allowed the case to be solved. The room listened to facts many people there had known for most of their lives. Then, James Paul Forte was named as the person responsible. The statement rested upon the direct DNA match between his remains and the biological profile from Maurice's jacket. Nearly 58 years of uncertainty narrowed into that carefully supported sentence. Barron's voice carried emotion as he spoke about the family and the community. The case had affected generations of Hazleton residents and hundreds of members of Troop N. You can understand why professional distance became difficult when a file stayed present for so much of an investigator's life. The announcement didn't make the room triumphant. Forte was beyond prosecution. Maurice remained absent, and her parents hadn't lived to hear the answer. What the result offered was a grounded truth, reached through evidence rather than rumor. Carmen Marie Radke spoke for the family. She remembered the precious memories they held of Maurice and acknowledged that the emptiness of her absence would always remain. You can hear the care in that distinction, because knowing a name isn't the same as recovering what was lost. Ronald Chiverella also described the result as a sense of closure rather than complete closure. The family now knew who had been responsible, and they knew Forte wasn't alive to harm anyone else. Yet no forensic finding could answer the family's lifelong question of who Maurice might have become. Their words kept the announcement centered upon their sister. Maurice had loved music, had been learning the organ, and had imagined a life devoted to faith. You can return to the small sound of canned goods touching inside a bag, and remember that her final morning began with generosity. Eric spoke about the difficulty of the genealogical work and what it meant to help the Chiverella family. He didn't describe a single brilliant moment, because the identification hadn't emerged that way. It came through low matches, discarded branches, new samples, and the willingness to keep finding another avenue. The investigators credited him openly. His age made the partnership unusual, though the quality of his work had earned their trust. You can imagine the coffee shop meeting returning briefly to mind when an uncertain offer first became a serious discussion. They also credited the original investigators and every later trooper who had touched the case. More than 230 members of the Pennsylvania State Police had contributed over the decades. Their combined work had produced thousands of pages and preserved the evidence long enough for science to change. The statistics of the match were explained, along with the sequence from the 2007 profile to genealogical testing and eventual exhumation. Each step sounded concise when presented at the podium. Only the people who had performed the work fully understood how much waiting occupied the spaces between those sentences. You can look around the room and see those spaces represented by age. A retired trooper's hands rest beside a younger investigator's notes, while a college student sits near siblings who were children when the case began. The Chiverella evidence box has gathered them across time, without ever leaving Hazleton far behind. Camera shutters made brief mechanical sounds, but the mood remained measured. Reporters asked how Forte had been identified and whether he had been considered in 1964. The investigators answered that his name hadn't appeared in the original inquiry and that no known connection to Maurice or her family had been found. That lack of connection left some questions open. Police couldn't say precisely when Forte first noticed Maurice, whether he encountered her by chance or how long the episode had been in his thoughts. The DNA identified him, but it didn't recreate every movement of the morning. Investigators reviewed his later record and asked whether other unexamined cases might bear some connection to him. They encouraged anyone with relevant information to come forward. The request wasn't meant to create speculation, but to allow surviving facts a final opportunity to reach the proper record. Forte had died in 1980, reportedly after a heart attack, and had spent the intervening years without being publicly connected to Maurice. You can place that fact beside the evidence box and feel the unequal movement of time. His life continued for 16 years after hers ended, while her family continued waiting long after his death. The news conference could name him, though it couldn't ask him why. It could explain the laboratory findings, though it couldn't recover memories he never shared. This is why even a solved cold case may retain a quiet border of uncertainty around its central answer. After the prepared remarks, conversations formed in smaller groups. Retired investigators compared recollections. Reporters approached family members, and technicians began adjusting cameras. You can hear chair legs touch the floor and the soft murmur returning to the room. Maurice's photograph remained at the front. Flowers stood nearby, their color gentle against the neutral walls, while the trooper's hat represented the long institutional promise carried through the file. The display didn't erase sorrow, but it gave the room a place to rest its attention. For some retired officers, the result may have felt like receiving a reply to a message sent decades earlier. They had written reports, gathered evidence, and passed the file forward without knowing who would read it next. Now the answer had returned through methods they couldn't have imagined when they began. The laboratory technicians weren't all present, yet their work lived inside the statistics spoken at the podium. So did the cooperation of relatives who provided samples and family historians who shared their records. You can see how the identification belonged to many quiet contributions rather than one sudden act. When the cameras eventually stopped, the Chiverella file still required administrative care. Final reports had to be completed, evidence records updated, and the investigative determination entered into the official system. A public announcement doesn't close a box by itself. You return with the troopers to their desks, where the language becomes formal again. James Paul Forte's name is placed beside the laboratory finding, and the steps supporting that identification are recorded in sequence. The pages are reviewed for accuracy, because this may be the last major entry added to a file opened in 1964. The direct profile from Forte's remains is linked to its collection records. The comparison report is linked to Maurice's preserved jacket, and the genealogical findings explain how investigators reached him. You can follow each connection without needing to hurry. Outside the office, Hazleton continues through an ordinary February day. Cars move along wet winter streets. Furnace smoke rises above rooftops. and the airport road carries people who may know the case only as something their parents once discussed. The city has changed, though Marie's name remains familiar. Inside, one folder contains the oldest witness statements, their typewriter letters uneven and faint. Another contains clean laboratory printouts from nearly 6 decades later. When you place them side by side, the contrast shows how investigative tools changed while the basic obligations stayed the same. Someone had to notice, record, preserve, and return. Someone had to admit when a test couldn't answer the question and leave enough material for a better test later. The Chiverella evidence box survived because many people practiced that form of restraint. The jacket had spent most of those years out of sight. It didn't appear in public exhibits, and it didn't need to. Its importance came from secure storage, documented handling, and the decision to keep it connected to every page explaining its origin. You can imagine the package returning to its protected place after the final testing. Its seal and documentation now tell a longer story than before. It no longer holds only an unknown profile. It holds the evidence that allowed investigators to identify James Paul Forte. There is a tenderness in careful record keeping when the record belongs to someone who can no longer speak. Labels and signatures may look impersonal, yet they prevent a person's history from dissolving into rumor. For Marie's, the preserved evidence carried her case beyond the limits of every individual career. The original detectives had worked without knowing whether their efforts would succeed. That uncertainty didn't excuse them from being thorough. You can feel their presence in the scene sketches, the measurements, and the evidence logs that later scientists relied upon. Modern investigators worked under a different uncertainty. They knew DNA could identify people, but they didn't know whether this particular degraded sample and these distant matches would lead anywhere. Their answer came only after they respected the limitations at every stage. Eric's family trees also became part of that record. Most branches didn't contain Forte, yet they showed why other possibilities had been excluded. You can scroll through them slowly, seeing ordinary families whose names briefly touched the investigation before the genetics moved elsewhere. The useful branch eventually narrows toward Hazelton. It passes through ancestors who couldn't have known that small inherited segments would be compared by strangers generations later. Their births and marriages, recorded for everyday civil purposes, became coordinates in a forensic search. That aspect of genetic genealogy invites careful thought. People who upload DNA for family research may create connections reaching far beyond themselves. Investigators use such databases under policies and permissions that have continued to change as the method has developed. In the Chiverella case, the distant matches provided leads rather than proof. The final identification still required a direct forensic comparison with Forte's remains. You can keep that distinction beside you because it explains both the usefulness and the limits of the family tree. The genealogical search did what the original databases couldn't. A conventional database asked whether the unknown profile directly matched a stored offender profile, while the genealogical search asked whether portions of it resembled profiles from biological relatives. One sought the person, and the other sought the family around him. Once that family region became visible, traditional investigation returned to the foreground. Troopers interviewed relatives, checked addresses, reviewed criminal records, collected voluntary samples, and obtained authorization for the exhumation. The newer method didn't replace police work. It gave the older work somewhere specific to look. You can see the partnership reflected in the final file. Digital charts sit beside typed reports, and statistical calculations sit beside street maps. Each form of evidence answers a different part of the question. The street map confirms that Forte lived close enough for an encounter to be possible. His age confirms that he belonged within the relevant group of male relatives. His later history gave investigators reason for additional concern, while the direct DNA match established the identity. No one fact needed to carry more weight than it could support. That balance allowed the conclusion to remain calm and firm. You don't need dramatic language when the evidence has been assembled properly. As the final reports move through review, the old evidence box is opened once more for an inventory. The folders make a dry whisper against one another, and the faint smell of paper rises beneath the archive light. You recognize details from the beginning now, though their meaning has changed. The handwritten date from the 18th of March, 1964, no longer leads only toward an unknown man. The laboratory report from 2007 no longer ends with a fruitless database search. The genealogical notes from 2020 now connect those old pages to James Paul Forte. Yet, the file also contains every year when the answer wasn't available. Those quiet intervals remain part of the story, because they show how evidence can wait without becoming useless. You can turn through them at the same unhurried pace, noticing renewed checks, forwarded tips, and the names of investigators who refuse to discard the question. One report may represent an afternoon of work that led nowhere. Another may record a telephone call from someone remembering a car many years later. Not every page contributed directly to Forte's identification, but each reflects the community's continuing wish to understand what happened to Maurice. The evidence box therefore holds more than the successful path. It contains mistakes corrected, theories tested, and possibilities set aside when facts didn't support them. That completeness matters because a trustworthy answer depends partly upon knowing how competing explanations were examined. You can place the lid beside the box rather than closing it yet. There are still pages concerning the early suspects, the recurring anniversaries, and the changing ways investigators spoke about Maurice across the decades. Their edges are worn from handling, and the next folder opens with the subdued resistance of paper that has rested a long time. I'm checking the older investigative record and the later cold case handoffs, so this next stretch can stay specific without inventing names or leads. The first pages inside that folder return you to the days immediately after Maurice was found, when every unfamiliar movement seemed worthy of another question. Investigators recorded names, descriptions, addresses, and possible vehicles, then checked each account against the narrow morning timeline. The pages smell faintly of dust and old cardboard, while the typewritten letters vary as different machines and different hands enter the record. Some leads began with direct observations, though many arrived through rumor. A resident might remember a car moving slowly, a stranger near a corner, or someone whose behavior had seemed unusual after the news spread. You can imagine the officers listening without dismissing the caller, then separating what had actually been seen from what had been heard elsewhere. That separation took time. A story repeated across several households could sound like independent confirmation, even when everyone had received it from the same original conversation. Investigators had to trace each account backward, just as Eric Schubert would later trace family lines backward until the true point of origin became clear. The tools were different, but the habit was familiar. You begin with something incomplete, ask where it came from, and resist giving it more certainty than it deserves. In 1964, that might mean finding the first person who mentioned a vehicle, rather than counting how many neighbors later described it. The Chiverella file preserves the labor of those distinctions. One statement leads to a second interview. The second interview prompts a record check, and the record check may end with a short notation explaining that no connection was established. You turn several pages and feel how much work can be contained within a single quiet sentence. People whose routines placed them near Marie's route were interviewed. Workers, drivers, residents, and anyone remembered along the streets could be asked where they had been during the relevant hours. The questions were practical, repeated in similar order, and written down while memories were still close to the day. The investigators also examined people already known to police for behavior that seemed relevant. Each required an individual inquiry because a prior record doesn't establish responsibility for another event. You can see the caution in a well-kept file, where suspicion is treated as a reason to check facts rather than permission to assume them. Alibis had to be confirmed through other people, business records, receipts, schedules, and travel times. A person might claim to have been at work, but investigators still needed to know when the shift began and who actually saw him. The office clock ticked, telephones rang, and another officer left to visit another doorway. Some inquiries ended quickly. A reliable witness placed the person elsewhere, or the description proved incompatible with the known evidence. The investigator recorded the reason, signed the page, and allowed that name to leave the active list. Other leads lasted longer because records were incomplete or accounts differed. You can imagine two detectives laying statements side by side beneath a lamp, marking where the times agree and where they separate. Neither raises his voice because the disagreement itself may be ordinary memory rather than deception. The morning timeline remained central. Marie's was last seen at about 10 minutes past 8, and she should have reached St. Joseph's after a short walk. Investigators studied the period before the early afternoon discovery, knowing that every plausible account had to fit within those hours. Time estimates from witnesses are rarely exact. A person may remember a radio program beginning, a delivery arriving, or a child leaving for school, then use that event to estimate the clock. You can follow those anchors patiently, understanding why one report might say shortly after 8, while another offers a more precise minute. Weather and daylight also shaped recollection. March light in northeastern Pennsylvania can be pale and flat, and a cold morning keeps many people behind closed windows. The glass may have held a trace of indoor condensation, softening whatever passed beyond it. A witness looking through such a window could recall color more easily than a license number. Another person might remember the sound of an engine, but not the direction it traveled. You sit with those limitations as the detectives did, accepting that honest memories can still be incomplete. Vehicle leads required broad searches. Without automated plate readers or connected registration systems, officers depended upon descriptions, local knowledge, and records that had to be requested manually. A dark sedan or light-colored truck could belong to many people, and each possible match demanded more than a glance. The same was true of physical descriptions. Witnesses often use familiar categories for height, build, hair, and clothing. Yet those categories can cover large portions of a town. You can see why the investigators collected them anyway, hoping several small details might overlap around one person. No such overlap led them to James Paul Forte. He remained outside the known path, despite living within a few blocks of the Chiverella family. The old folder gives no sign that officers had reason to place his photograph before a witness or ask him about that morning. His absence can feel puzzling only when you read the file with the final answer already known. In 1964, Hazleton contained many young men who lived nearby, drove local roads, and had no documented connection to Marie's. Investigators couldn't interview an entire city without some fact guiding their attention. This is why cold case review requires humility toward earlier work. A later detective may possess a name unavailable to the first team. Then notice how neatly it fits geography and age. That doesn't mean the name was obvious before the new evidence created a path toward it. You can mark Forte's residence on the modern working map, then remove the mark and look again through the eyes of the first investigators. Without genetic genealogy, it becomes another unremarkable household among many. The streets remain the same, but the investigative meaning disappears. The early file continued expanding through interviews and searches. Paper gathered in folders until each folder required labels, dividers, and indexes. The slight pressure of the stack caused lower pages to curve, while frequently handled corners became smooth beneath officers' fingers. A major investigation also generates administrative material, evidence transfers, laboratory requests, telephone messages, assignments, maps, photographs, and supplemental reports must all remain connected. You may spend an hour reading documents that describe how other documents moved, yet that chain is what keeps the underlying evidence trustworthy. The jacket appears in those records not as a symbol, but as an item with identifiers and custody entries. Someone records its recovery, another its packaging, and later personnel document each authorized examination. You can feel how formal language protects a fragile link across decades. If an item changes hands without documentation, later investigators may struggle to show where it was or who could have handled it. The Chiverella evidence remained useful because the chain could still be understood when the DNA laboratory finally examined it. Paperwork that once seemed routine became the bridge supporting new science. The original packaging methods belonged to their era. Forensic standards would develop considerably in later decades, especially as laboratories learned how easily biological evidence could be contaminated. Yet the essential choice to retain the material gave future specialists something real to work with. You can imagine a later evidence custodian encountering the older package during an inventory. The handwriting looks different from modern labels, and the paper has lost some flexibility, but the identifiers still correspond with the case ledger. The custodian checks them and returns the item to controlled storage. Inventories are another quiet form of detective work. They confirm that an object expected on a shelf is truly there, still sealed and still linked to the correct file. No headline follows such a check, though the future of a case may depend upon it. As months passed in 1964, the immediate intensity of the Chiverella investigation gradually changed. Leads that arrived daily became less frequent, and officers had other cases requiring attention. The file didn't vanish, but its rhythm slowed. This transition can be difficult for a family. Police activity is visible at first, with cars arriving, officers calling, and neighbors being questioned. When that activity becomes quieter, loved ones may fear that quietness means forgetting. For the Chiverellas, Maurice remained present in family life regardless of the investigative tempo. Her brothers and sister remembered her personality, her music, and the ordinary household moments that no police report could fully contain. You can picture an empty place within family photographs taken in later years, though her earlier image remains nearby. Their parents continued hoping for an answer. They had trusted the investigators and wanted the person responsible to be identified, but they didn't frame that wish as revenge. The difference matters because their hope centered upon truth and accountability rather than another act of harm. Year after year, the 18th of March returned. In Hazleton, the date carried a public memory as well as a private one. Newspaper references and community conversations kept Maurice's name from becoming merely a number in an archive. You can imagine an anniversary clipping added to the case folder. Fresh newsprint feels soft and slightly oily at first, then becomes brittle as the years pass. A photograph of Maurice appears beside a request for information, asking anyone who still remembers something to contact police. Anniversary appeals serve several purposes. They remind the public that a case remains open. They reach people who may now feel able to speak, and they show a family that the investigation hasn't been abandoned. Yet they also produce calls that must be evaluated with the same care as earlier leads. A caller decades later may sincerely believe a memory belongs to 1964, though time has blended several events together. Investigators listen, compare, and search for independent support. You can hear the gentleness required when telling someone that a remembered detail can't be verified. Other callers may offer theories built from coincidence. A person moved away soon after the case, behaved strangely, or resembled a description published years earlier. Each idea still requires checking, but resemblance and timing alone rarely establish a reliable connection. The Chiverella file grew through these later inquiries until it contained more than 4,700 pages. That figure can seem abstract until you imagine lifting the complete record. The binders and folders would carry real weight, pressing into your forearms as you moved them across an evidence room table. No investigator could hold every page in immediate memory. Indexes, summaries, and timelines became essential, especially when responsibility passed to someone new. You begin by reading the overview, then follow references into the original documents whenever a detail matters. A summary can save time, though it may also flatten uncertainty. An old witness who said a car might have been blue can become, after several retellings, a witness who saw a blue car. Careful reviewers return to the first statement and restore the hesitation. That practice keeps the file honest. You don't improve an old lead by making its language firmer than the witness intended. The unanswered spaces must remain visible, even when certainty would make the story easier to tell. More than 230 members of the Pennsylvania State Police contributed to the Chiverella investigation over its lifetime. not including every civilian laboratory employee or outside helper. Some involvement lasted years, while another person's contribution may have occupied a single shift. Each signed report shows where one small responsibility entered the larger effort. The names change as you turn the pages. Rank abbreviations shift, office addresses are updated, and typewriters give way to word processors. Yet the standard closing lines continue to record who performed the work and when. Retired Trooper James Quiros was among those later credited for his sustained involvement. Retired Trooper Sean Williams also contributed before the final genealogical phase. You can picture each receiving the inherited folders, finding a clear place on the desk, and beginning the long act of learning what others had already tried. Taking over a cold case differs from responding to a new one. You weren't present at the original scene, and most witnesses no longer remember your face. Everything you know arrives through another person's language, photographs, and measurements. A reviewer must therefore develop a kind of second-hand familiarity. You learn which streets appear repeatedly, which witnesses were interviewed more than once, and which leads consumed months without producing a result. The file becomes a landscape, though you entered it years after the weather changed. Older photographs assist that process. Their surfaces may show fingerprints along the borders from repeated handling, while the image itself holds buildings, road edges, and terrain that no longer exist in the same form. You angle one under the light and notice details hidden by glare. Maps can be compared with current aerial images, but the differences require care. Roads are widened, lots are filled, and mining land is reclaimed or repurposed. A distance that seems open on a modern screen may have felt entirely different in 1964. Investigators revisiting the area could still walk portions of Maurice's route. You can join them in thought, moving at an ordinary pace between familiar blocks, while noting sight lines and intersections. The pavement beneath your shoes belongs to the present, but the route in the file remains fixed to that March morning. The shortness of the walk remained one of its most troubling features. Maurice was traveling through a part of Hazleton familiar to her, toward a school she attended routinely. Somewhere within that ordinary route, the known timeline ceased. Cold case detectives can't recreate a lost witness merely by walking the same street. What they can do is understand scale, timing, and the practical choices available to someone in the area. You feel how close the school was, and why her absence became apparent so quickly. They could also reconsider transportation. The discovery site near the airport lay far enough from her route to suggest movement beyond a child's intended walk. Investigators examined how vehicles might have traveled between the streets and the coal refuse area, though the passage of time prevented exact reconstruction. Again, James Paul Forte's later identification answered identity without supplying a complete route. Police could establish that his DNA was on Maurice's jacket, but no surviving record documented the vehicle used or the precise sequence of streets. You allow those details to remain unwritten rather than filling them with imagination. This restraint protects Maurice from becoming a figure in someone else's invented drama. The facts are sorrowful enough, and the investigative story doesn't need embellishment. We stay with what was recorded, preserved, tested, and finally established through the 1970s. Forensic science continued advancing in other areas, though individual DNA identification still lay ahead. Blood group testing could sort samples into broad categories, and microscopy could compare hairs or fibers. Such methods sometimes excluded people, but they couldn't offer the statistical individuality later associated with DNA. Forte's arrest in 1974 occurred within that older forensic world. Authorities investigating the unrelated assault could collect and compare physical evidence using available methods, but there was no national DNA system linking him with biological material preserved in the Chiverella case. The two investigations remain separate. You can place both folders on an imagined table and see how close the truth came without crossing. One contains Maurice's unknown biological evidence, and the other contains a named man with a serious assault record. The scientific connector between them hadn't yet been built. This kind of missed connection appears different in hindsight. Today, investigators routinely consider database comparison when a qualifying DNA profile exists. In 1974, the necessary profile, databases, collection laws, and laboratory methods were absent. Forte received probation after pleading guilty to aggravated assault. Whatever records were created remained associated with that case, not automatically carried into every unresolved investigation. You can hear a file drawer close, leaving his name on one side of the office system, while Maurice's evidence waited elsewhere. His second arrest in 1978 also failed to connect him to the Chiverella file. Publicly available information about its outcome remained limited, and investigators later avoided claiming more than the record supported. 2 years afterward, Forte died at 38. His death in 1980 occurred before forensic DNA profiling became an operational investigative tool. There was therefore no routine reason to collect and store his genetic profile. When the Chiverella sample entered modern databases decades later, Forte himself wasn't waiting inside them. This explains the repeated absence of a direct match after 2007. A database result can look comprehensive on a screen, yet it represents only the people and samples actually included. You can search perfectly and still receive nothing because the correct person was never entered. The monthly database checks carried that limitation forward. New offender profiles were added, and the Chiverella profile was compared against them again. Each month created another possibility that a relative or the unknown man had entered the system through a qualifying event. The routine may have required only a modest amount of active time once automated processes existed, but someone still monitored the result. You can imagine a recurring calendar note, the click of a search confirmation, and the familiar line indicating that no association had been found. Month after month, the answer remained absent. The investigator records the result and moves to other work, knowing the next update may be different. This is patience stripped of atmosphere, reduced to a repeated administrative act. Yet repetition protected the opportunity. Had the profile been forgotten after its first unsuccessful search, later database growth would have offered no benefit. The Chiverella case stayed positioned to receive a match even when none arrived. The development of DNA profiling itself had unfolded gradually. Early methods required larger, better preserved samples, while later techniques became capable of working with smaller and older traces. Laboratories refined their controls, statistical models, and quality standards as the field matured. For an old case, Each improvement invites a difficult question. Should remaining material be tested now, or saved for a future method that may extract more information? You can feel the responsibility in that decision, especially when the sample is limited and irreplaceable. Testing in 2007 had already achieved something remarkable by producing the unknown male profile. The result allowed exclusions and database searches, but it didn't consume the entire meaning of the evidence. Later testing could use other marker systems to create a genealogical profile. The jacket, therefore, served two generations of DNA science. One asked whether the contributor matched a known forensic profile, while the next searched for shared inheritance among distant relatives. You can see the difference as two transparent maps placed over the same biological terrain. Parabon Nanolabs entered the Chiverella investigation when the Pennsylvania State Police sought that broader approach. The company worked with DNA evidence to produce information suitable for investigative genealogy. Handling an old sample still required caution because age and prior testing could limit what remained. The laboratory needed many points across the genome rather than the smaller set commonly used for direct forensic comparison. These points, called single nucleotide polymorphisms, vary across people and pass through families in recognizable segments. You don't need to remember the technical name. You can simply imagine thousands of small markers creating a pattern of inheritance. A conventional profile resembles a compact identity tag. A genealogical profile is more like a wide landscape showing which portions may have been inherited alongside those of other people. The second contains enough distributed information to detect distant biological relationships. Once generated, the Chiverella genealogical data could be compared with profiles in a database whose users had made them available under the applicable rules. The search didn't identify Forte. It produced people sharing small portions of DNA with the unknown contributor. One match may have reflected a relationship as distant as a sixth cousin. At that distance, the two people can share ancestors born many generations earlier and may have no knowledge of one another. You can understand why the first match opened work rather than ending it. A sixth cousin can lead toward a vast number of descendants. Each child in each generation creates another branch, and movement between towns broadens the search further. The genealogist must find where several match lines converge and which descendants eventually connect to the relevant place. Low matches also require attention to chance and data quality. Very small segments may be difficult to interpret, and relationship ranges can overlap. Eric's approach was to keep seeking additional samples and higher value matches rather than relying too heavily upon a single distant connection. The family trees accumulated as working hypotheses. A chart might propose that two matches descended from a common couple. Then a new document or DNA result would test that proposal. You can watch the chart change without treating revision as failure. This flexibility became one of the investigation's strengths. When a line pursued for weeks proved incorrect, the team moved towards the next plausible route. They didn't remain attached to a surname simply because it had already consumed effort. Attachment to a theory can make an investigator interpret every new fact as support. The Chiverella team worked against that tendency by using exclusions actively. A negative sample wasn't disappointing evidence. It was reliable information removing the wrong branch. You can see the same principle in the older police reports. An alibi confirmed in 1964 and a DNA exclusion obtained decades later perform similar work. Both protect an innocent person while making the remaining search more precise. The physical sensations of the two eras differ. The older detective works with carbon copies, ink stamps, and a telephone cord curling across the desk. The modern genealogist works with illuminated screens, searchable records, and digital charts that expand beyond a single page. Their mental task remains surprisingly close. Each must notice discrepancies, verify identities, and keep similar names from becoming confused. You can imagine both pausing over a birth date that doesn't quite fit. Hazelton's family histories added their own complexity. Like many northeastern Pennsylvania communities, the city included families whose ancestors arrived through different waves of migration, then remained in the region across several generations. Surnames might be common locally, while rare elsewhere, helping one search and complicating another. Church records, civil certificates, obituaries, and cemetery entries could each supply different pieces. A baptismal record might preserve a parent's full name, while an obituary reveals married daughters and distant residences. You move among those sources, as if among rooms in a quiet archive. Newspaper databases made some searches faster, though older pages could be faint or poorly indexed. A surname distorted by optical recognition might remain invisible until someone tried another spelling. Eric had learned to vary searches and examine surrounding records rather than depend upon one exact result. The work could continue late into the evening. A college building settles after most people leave. Radiators click, and a screen becomes the brightest object in the room. You follow another marriage into another county, then discover that the descendant returned to Hazelton decades later. That geographic return may be the useful fact. Genetic genealogy doesn't merely seek related people. In a forensic case, it seeks related people who also fit the time and place. The Chiverella investigation required the tree to touch northeastern Pennsylvania in 1964. The police supplied that local focus. They knew the streets, the history, and the case details that couldn't be shared publicly. Eric supplied the patience to extend each genetic branch until its geographic meaning became visible. Their conversations often concerned what to try next. A weak result might suggest obtaining a sample from another side of the family, while a documentary gap might require locating someone who maintained private family records. You can hear the practical tone of those exchanges, each ending with another task rather than a celebration. Community members became part of the solution through their willingness to assist. Some provided DNA, others explained relationships, and family historians shared knowledge assembled over years. Their contributions were voluntary points of light across a complicated tree. It would be easy to describe this process as technology solving the Chiverella case, but technology alone didn't choose whom to contact or how to interpret an incomplete obituary. It couldn't persuade a relative to listen, nor could it understand the local significance of a Hazelton address. Human patience remained between every computational step. The same was true inside the laboratory. Instruments produced data, while trained analysts decided whether the data met quality standards. Controls, peer review, and documentation transformed machine output into evidence that investigators could trust. You can place those modern laboratory records beside the first evidence form again. Both depend upon handwriting or electronic signatures confirming that someone accepted responsibility for the step. The tools change, but accountability remains personal. The Chiverella evidence box demonstrates why old physical objects sometimes become more informative with age, provided they're protected. Time usually erodes evidence, yet scientific progress can enlarge what a preserved sample is able to say. The box was losing paper brightness while gaining potential. That potential wasn't automatic. Evidence stored without context becomes merely an object, and context stored without evidence becomes an account that may never be tested. The Chiverella file kept both together. The jacket's location, recovery, and handling were described in the written record. The biological profile could therefore be interpreted as belonging to the case rather than appearing as an unexplained laboratory sample. You can trace the continuity from the coal refuse area to the evidence room, then onward to successive laboratories. Each seal along that route represented a pause. The item was closed after collection, opened for authorized examination, resealed, and returned. You can almost hear adhesive lifting carefully from older packaging as technicians prepare another documented access. Modern testing also required contamination awareness that the first investigators couldn't have anticipated. Many people may have handled clothing or packaging before DNA precautions became routine. Analysts therefore considered sample location, profile quality, and whether the biological material had a clear relationship to the offense. The unknown male profile, derived from the relevant stain, was suitable for comparison. Later, Forte's direct profile aligned with it at the tested markers. The statistical strength helped distinguish a true source identification from incidental handling or a coincidental partial resemblance. For all the complexity between them, those two profiles originated from simple physical acts of preservation and sampling. One was retained from Maurice's jacket, and the other was obtained from Forte's remains after the genealogical investigation focused upon him. You can hold their distance in time without needing to make it dramatic. Nearly 58 years separated the collections. During that span, Maurice's siblings grew from children into older adults, and the original troopers entered retirement. The evidence remained within its controlled chain, waiting for the comparison no one could perform at the beginning. The public announcement in February of 2022 brought many of those timelines into one room. Yet after reporters left, the evidence still required storage, and the family still returned to private life. A solved identification doesn't turn every part of experience into public history. For the Chiverella siblings, memories of Maurice belonged first to the family. The world knew a school photograph and the outline of her final morning, while they knew her voice, habits, and place within the household. You can sense how much remains outside even the most complete police file. No report can reproduce the sound of her practicing the organ. It can note that she played, but not the pace of a familiar hymn or the way a room felt when she stopped. The family preserved those details through memory rather than evidence packaging. Her wish to become a nun also carried more meaning for them than a biographical line. It reflected the faith shaping her childhood, the school she attended, and the feast day gift she carried. The cans weren't random belongings. They belonged to an intention understood within her daily life. When investigators described those details at the news conference, they restored some of Maurice's personhood to a case, often reduced to its unanswered question. You remember her as a child preparing for school, not merely as the source of an old forensic sample. This emphasis mattered to Eric as well. He later said that Maurice's memory, rather than Forte's name, should endure. Genetic genealogy had identified the person responsible, but its human purpose was to provide answers for the people who had continued loving her. You can return to the press conference photograph and notice the arrangement. Maurice's portrait stands with flowers and a trooper's hat, while Forte's yearbook image appears as evidence of identity. One is being remembered, and the other is being named because accountability requires a name. The distinction is quiet, but important. True attention belongs to the person whose life was taken, and to those who preserved the question. The identified man occupies the record because the truth demands it, not because he deserves fascination. After the announcement, residents of Hazleton shared memories of how the case had affected childhood in the city. Some recalled parents warning them not to walk alone, or invoking Maurice's name when explaining caution. Those warnings passed through families even when younger listeners didn't know every detail. A local case can become part of community language this way. It enters ordinary instructions, school conversations, and the unease surrounding places once considered harmless. You can hear an older resident speaking softly about how the city felt before and after the 18th of March. Corporal Barron described that change publicly. What happened to Maurice altered the way people lived in Hazleton, whether they welcomed the change or not. The streets themselves remained, but trust in their familiarity had shifted. Solving the identity question couldn't restore the earlier city. It could, however, remove the unnamed figure who had occupied local memory for nearly 6 decades. Residents now knew that the responsible person had been James Paul Forte, and that he had died in 1980. Some may have searched their own memories for him after seeing the yearbook photograph. A former patron might recall the bar where he worked, or a schoolmate might remember him among many other young people. Such recollections arrived too late to question him, though investigators remained willing to receive relevant information. That willingness reflected an unfinished practical concern. Identifying Forte in the Chiverella case raised the possibility that other unsolved events might warrant comparison. Police didn't announce that he was responsible for anything else, and caution remained essential. His known 1974 assault showed harmful behavior a decade after Maurice's death, but it didn't establish a pattern beyond the documented cases. You keep the language narrow, allowing the record to carry exactly what it can support. Investigators could review other preserved evidence if a suitable reason emerged. Now that Forte's profile existed, it might be compared lawfully where appropriate. The same science that named him in one file could exclude him from another. Exclusion would be as important as association. Once a notorious name becomes public, speculation can attach it to every unresolved event nearby. Reliable DNA comparison protects other cases from that drift. The Chiverella investigation had itself benefited from such discipline. Hundreds of names and theories passed through the file without being treated as facts. You can see why the final identification felt solid. It didn't depend upon a favored story, but upon a direct match reached through documented steps. The probability figure of 1 in 480 septillion conveyed overwhelming statistical support, yet the case didn't rest upon the number alone. The sample's origin, chain of custody, genealogical pathway, and direct comparison all worked together. Statistics, separated from context, can sound magical. Context shows the labor beneath them. You move from the old jacket to the laboratory profile, from distant relatives to family trees, from Forte's grave to the confirming sample, and every link remains visible. This visibility is one reason the case became an instructive example for other cold case investigators. Agencies could see the value of saving old evidence, revisiting it as methods improved, and considering collaboration when internal resources were limited. The lesson wasn't merely to use genealogy, but to prepare evidence so genealogy could be used responsibly. The partnership with Eric also demonstrated how specialized knowledge may come from unexpected places. He was young, but his experience with complex family identification had begun years earlier. The police evaluated his methods, rather than accepting or rejecting him solely because of age. Their coffee shop conversation functioned as an interview. They asked how he would work through low matches, and he explained practical alternatives. You can imagine the investigators listening for both technical skill and the patience required to handle sensitive family information. Trust developed through the work itself. Eric provided leads that the troopers could test, and he revised his views when results contradicted them. The investigators shared what he needed within the partnership and maintained control over law enforcement decisions. That structure later influenced broader capacity. Members involved in such work gained experience with investigative genetic genealogy, and Pennsylvania State Police developed greater internal knowledge of the method. The Chiverella case therefore contributed not only an answer but also a model for future patient investigations. You can picture another old evidence box somewhere in the state, its label carrying a different name and year. The people opening it may benefit from procedures refined through Marie's case. Yet our attention remains here, with the box under the lamp and the next folder resting open. This folder contains copies of the laboratory correspondence surrounding the 2007 profile. The pages are cleaner than the 1964 statements, and their printed text is evenly dark. A barcode occupies one corner, while handwritten initials confirm that someone reviewed the result. The first report establishes that a male profile had been developed from the relevant evidence. Another page records its database submission, and later entries document the repeated searches. You run a finger beside the dates, seeing the years accumulate without a match. There is something restful in the regularity of those checks, even though each one once carried disappointment. The investigator performs the task, records the outcome, and leaves the profile ready for another month. Nothing is forced. 1 month becomes 12, then several years. Database holdings expand, laboratory software changes, and office computers are replaced. The case identifier remains constant, carrying Maurice's evidence through each upgrade. When Parabon's work begins, the correspondence changes tone. Technical discussions concern whether sufficient material exists and which analysis may be possible. You can sense careful optimism. restrained by the knowledge that old samples don't always produce usable genealogical data. The successful profile opens another group of documents. Database policies, match summaries, and genealogical notes enter the file alongside traditional police reports. The paper box begins holding records of a digital investigation. Some pages may never need to be printed, yet official files often preserve key results in durable form. You can imagine a chart reduced to fit the page, its names small, and its connecting lines finer than pencil marks. The tree is difficult to read until you lean closer. At its outer edges are distant relatives who never knew Maurice or Forte. Nearer the center, shared ancestors connect those relatives through generations. The line toward Hazleton is only one among many until additional samples begin closing the others. You turn the chart and find Eric's explanatory notes. A relationship is described cautiously, with alternatives listed where the DNA amount permits more than one possibility. His language shows the difference between knowing how people may be related and proving how they are. Beside those notes are police follow-up reports. A trooper confirms an address, documents an interview, or records that a relative agreed to provide a sample. The two forms of investigation move in parallel down the page. A later report reduces the possible men to 4. Their names sit within a private investigative context, because at that stage, none had been directly matched. You pause over the care required to protect people who might soon be excluded. Only Forte's name ultimately moves into the public record. The others return to private life, their temporary relevance ending with the evidence that narrowed elsewhere. A responsible account has no reason to preserve suspicion around them. The Forte branch receives further documentation. His birth and death are verified, his Hazleton residence is established, and his criminal history is obtained through official records. None of these entries alone closes the case. Then the exhumation authorization appears. Its formal wording represents the point where indirect evidence became strong enough to justify a direct search. You can feel the investigation gathering itself into a single, precise request. The cemetery records confirm where Forte was buried. Professionals plan the recovery, identify the personnel required, and arrange transport for the sample. Winter dates appear beside signatures, their ink fresh compared with the first reports. The laboratory accession form follows. It records receipt of the material and the condition of its seals. You can hear a package set gently onto a clean counter, while 2 people verify its identifiers. Next comes the analytical report. Technical terms fill the page, but the central finding remains clear, even to a tired reader. Forte's direct profile matches the unknown male profile obtained from the evidence on Maurice's jacket. That page changes every one before it. The early interviews remain inconclusive, the monthly searches remain negative, and the family trees still contain their discarded branches. Yet their place within the larger record is finally understood. You turn back through them without asking them to become anything else. An investigation isn't made successful by erasing its long periods of uncertainty. Those periods show how knowledge was built and where its limits remained. The Chiverella file keeps the waiting beside the answer. The final administrative entries describe notification and public release. Family members were informed. Officials coordinated their statements, and the news conference presented the result. Even these pages retain the same report format used for more routine duties. There is no special paper for a 58-year answer. It is typed, dated, reviewed, and filed like any other supported finding. The ordinariness suits the case because its solution came through ordinary care repeated for an extraordinary length of time. You close that folder gently and reach for the one containing family statements and public recollections. Its pages are fewer, though their meaning extends beyond laboratory statistics. The first photograph shows Maurice at an age when school days, music lessons, and feast day gifts still formed the visible horizon of her life. Her expression belongs to a family memory before it belongs to an investigation. You let the photograph remain still, beneath the lamp, without trying to read knowledge into her face. Around its pale border, the paper has softened where relatives and detectives have held it over many years. The next page records the names of her siblings, who carried that photograph through adulthood. Their public words in 2022 were careful, shaped by sorrow, but also by gratitude toward the investigators. You begin reading slowly, while the archive fan turns, and the evening outside deepens almost imperceptibly. In those words, Marie's siblings allowed gratitude and sorrow to remain beside each other, without asking one feeling to cancel the other. They knew the identity of the man responsible, yet they still wondered about the years their sister should have lived. As you sit with their statement, you can hear how gently a family may hold an answer that arrived too late for their parents. The Rita Chiverella case is now officially solved. DNA established that James Paul Forte was responsible, and the Pennsylvania State Police closed the investigation after announcing his identification in February of 2022. Because Forte died in 1980, he could never be charged or brought before a court, and some details of that March morning will remain beyond the reach of the file. Still, the central uncertainty that followed the Chiverella family for nearly 58 years is no longer unnamed. The answer came through evidence preserved by early investigators, protected by those who followed, and finally understood through patient laboratory work and genetic genealogy. You can rest your hand beside the softened folder and feel the quiet continuity of that care. Marie's remains more than the child in the photograph, and more than the name attached to an old investigation. She is remembered as a gentle girl who loved music, who hoped to become a nun, and who left home carrying food as an act of kindness. The box may be closed now, though that kindness remains outside it, held by the family and the city that never forgot her. The archive fan continues its slow turning, and the small lamp leaves a warm circle across the desk. Nothing more is required from you tonight, and no unanswered ending is waiting beyond these final words. Let the old papers settle into silence, while Marisa's music rests softly in the room.